Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the launch of Open Secret's new investigative report, The Climate Consultants: How Management Consultants Cash In on the Climate Crisis. I'm your host today, Luvano Ntuli, and I'm an investigator at Open Secrets, as well as an author on this report. Unfortunately, Lester won't be able to join us today as he's fallen ill with the flu, and we send him our best wishes. Joining me today is investigator Zen Mathe, who is the project lead on the Climate Consultants, Michael Marchant, the head of investigations, and Ariella Scher, head of legal at Open Secrets. I'll hand over to them in a moment just to talk us through some of these talking points, but I just want to say welcome to this launch, and please do pop your questions in the chat. We will have a Q&A session towards the end. I know we all have some burning questions following this report. So yeah, I think Zen, can you talk us a little bit through, what this report is about, why it's important for Open Secrets to do this investigation, and why now? What are the pressing issues that, prompted Open Secrets to write this report?
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you, Luvano, and good afternoon to everybody joining us today. So the Climate Consultants is our latest investigative report that reveals how, as you've said, Luvano, management consultants are cashing in on the climate crisis with the focus on South Africa's climate and just energy transition space. And what this report really is about, and not to take too much time, it's about management consultants and institutions linked to donor countries receiving the lion's share of the grant funding of South Africa's just transition. So throughout this investigation, we've been looking at following the money as the premise and building the story around that. And we found that around 65% of the committed grant funds have gone to private corporations and organizations as implementing entities, and less than 25% of the grant monies have gone to local implementing entities such as non-governmental organizations, public sector institutions, and universities. And we've also found that often there is a direct link where the money between where the money comes from, so the donor country, and where the money goes, so the implementing entity. And as a result, consulting firms are playing a fundamental role in shaping South Africa's response to the climate and energy crisis, whether it's in their work for South Africa's largest fossil fuel companies and banks, or for public institutions and government. And they do so despite serious conflicts of interest, which is something we center in the report. Management consultants have permeated every sphere of activity of government and the private sector, yet they are regularly implicated in scandals and wrongdoings and enabling corruption and state capture. These scandals reflect systemic and sinister problem in the industry. They operate behind this veil of secrecy with little to no accountability. And this is not the first time Open Secrets has spotlighted the work of consultants more generally, but it's the first time we've looked at the role of consultants in South Africa's climate, just and energy transition space. And what we really put forward in this report and the findings that we make throughout the investigation is that given their track record and modus operandi in South Africa and elsewhere, it's concerning that private consultants have been given this opportunity to corner the market for advice on the climate crisis and a just transition with little to no scrutiny. They're usually taken as the voice of reason and the voice of command without anybody questioning where they get their expertise, do they have the expertise, and what might be the conflicts of interest. And the climate crisis and how we address it is one of the most urgent and defining issues of our time. South Africa is the first global country to conclude a formal just energy transition partnership agreement with international donors. Yet policy responses and regulations are increasingly being shaped by management consultants who see this as a new frontier for profit taking. So I think the report spotlights the roles played by these consulting firms and highlights that there must be public debate about how we hold these unelected private technocrats to account. We must critically consider the impact on South Africa's pursuit of an energy transition that is just and benefits the most vulnerable in our society and those that are most immediately affected in our society.
Thanks, Zen. Yeah, you've laid out quite a strong foundation, quite a strong case, I think. And I want to turn to Mike here because you've mentioned that, there have been instances in which management consultancies have not been held to account for their wrongdoing in other contexts. And I'm curious to know, Mike, in this context particularly, I mean, what is, how prominent are management consultants in this world of climate change and energy transitions? Where do they feature, and what is most notable about that?
Thanks very much, Luvano, and thank you very much for everyone who's joined the webinar today. The short answer as to how prominent these firms are is that they are very prominent. And I think a little bit of context is quite helpful for those listening about the extent of the management consulting industry. So as of a few years ago, management consulting is a $1 trillion industry. So $1 trillion every year is spent on these firms around the world by companies and by governments. And I mean, to give us a sense of scale, that's around 8 or 9 times the South Africa's entire national budget every year being spent on consultants. So it's a big industry. For the purposes of our discussion around climate change and energy, what's so remarkable is that almost all of the large consulting firms, in particular BCG, McKinsey, and Bain, but also some of the larger auditing and consulting firms, essentially have made it their mission to put climate change and energy transition consulting at the forefront of their businesses. So there's a couple of trends that we've seen. The one is that they are buying up a whole range of smaller consulting firms that focus on this and incorporating them into their businesses. And the second thing is that they're aggressively pursuing this work from both corporations and governments. So Luvano, later, you're going to speak a little bit about BCG, or a fair amount about BCG. I mean, the estimates from BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, is that within a year or two, 1/3 of all of their global revenue will come from climate and energy related consulting. And that is growing every year. So it really is a very kind of big focus. If you look at the global experience, what that means is that consulting firms are now endemic in these spaces. And for those who, for example, have followed the global climate negotiations, the COPs over the last few years, they will know how ever present those actors are, including kind of notoriously consulting firms like McKinsey doing huge oil and gas and fossil fuel deals on the sidelines of climate related negotiations that they are strategic advisors on. So I think in terms of that, the global experience already shows how much they're in the space and the endemic kind of conflicts of interests and secrecy concerns that there are. And maybe, Luvano, the final thing I'll say on this is that I've spoken a lot about the size of the industries and their extent. I think on the other side of that, the other concern we need to be aware of throughout this discussion is what that means for democratic processes. And I think really it's the sense that the more present consulting firms are in policy spaces, both within corporates and governments, how much of the policy decision-making is being taken by private actors outside the realm of public discussion and without public involvement. And that, I think, when we get to the case studies a little bit later, will come out even more.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think that's an important point. And I think, Ariella, I'm going to turn to you on this, just to kind of draw a little bit on, this kind of divide between public versus private when it comes to discussions on the just energy transition, on the climate crisis, and how affected communities are essentially left out of these processes, and private companies are able to line their pockets, as Mike has spoken to, making billions from this particular arm of consulting of theirs. So Ariella, if you could just tell us a little bit more about the just energy transition in our context, in the South African context, and what that looks like in and how it's been formalized in our laws.
Thanks, Luvano, and good afternoon, everyone. So South Africa's very recently, only in March this year, brought into effect our Climate Change Act. And it is a really groundbreaking piece of legislation, because it, for the first time, formalizes this definition of what a just transition is. It crystallizes it into law. And it refers to, and I can quote from the Act, a shift towards low carbon, climate resilient economy and society, and ecologically sustainable economies and societies, which contribute towards the creation of decent work for all, social inclusion, and the eradication of poverty. So I think in the report, when we refer to a just transition, we're referring to what the government is calling a just transition, rather than any outright recognition that the processes and the energy transition itself is underpinned by a sense of justice. But what the Climate Change Act requires is that the implementation and interpretation of the Act is guided by the need for decision-making to consider the needs of the most vulnerable. And I think it's from that perspective that we bring this report to demonstrate that actually that doesn't seem to be what's happening. Actually, in practicality, what's happening is that the most powerful and those who've always been in charge of our economies are just continuing to benefit. So that's from the legislative perspective. From the political perspective, South Africa's formal implementation of the expenditure of climate finance towards what it calls now the Just Energy Transition Partnership was kickstarted at the COP conference, COP26, which was in late 2021. And there, South Africa and 5 international partners formed what they call the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which we'll shorten in this webinar and also in the report to JETP. And we've confirmed there's no one agreement that binds all of the partners and South Africa. Rather, the apparent intention is for South Africa to enter into bilateral agreements with each partner. And then from that JETP, that system, there are now policies that flow from there. So these include the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, the JET Implementation Plan, and our understanding is that all of those are already in effect. So climate finance is flowing into South Africa. What we're trying to understand is where is it going to?
Thanks, Ariella. I think this is where it becomes a little bit complex and a little bit, and I think the notion of following the money is one that is really important throughout this report, as you've kind of spoken to as well with the JETP funds. And so, Zen, if I can turn back to you for a moment just to draw on what Ariella has spoken to, what does this report tell us about, those funds, that JETP money? How much is coming in? Where is it going? And as we point to later, some of the actors that are receiving this money.
Yeah, thanks, Luvano. And just following on from what Ariella has said, in our investigation and as we lay out quite detailed in this report, is that our findings have been that much of the expenditure on South Africa's just energy transition has happened in a system that seems to be parallel to the state. So that has not been subject to sufficient public oversight. So as far as possible, JET monies, and we recommend, as we found this, that JET monies should be routed through the South African state. We've been finding that there almost seems to be a cyclical flow of funds when it comes to South Africa's JET IP money and the money coming in that has been pledged by international donors. We're finding that, for example, if the UK has pledged a certain amount of funds, it has the decision-making power about where and to whom that money goes, even if it's towards South Africa's JET, Just Energy Transition money. So we found that a donor country can be sending in money, but then that it's going, they can decide that, we want an implementing entity that the money will be going through, such as PwC, which is headquartered in the UK, and that money almost comes from the UK, flows through the state for PwC to do just energy transition work in the country, and essentially gets paid that money, and essentially that money ends up not necessarily having the impact or coming into the South African state as it should be. So we make this recommendation that as far as possible, JET monies should be routed through the South African state and spent in compliance with the PFMA and allocated for spending through a process of climate responsive budgeting. I think where JET monies are not routed through the South African state, they must be nevertheless recorded in a publicly accessible repository and spent in a manner determined by the South African state itself. I think one of the other things, as Ariella has mentioned, and I think as will keep coming up in the conversation going forward, efforts must be made to ensure that all expenditure of climate and energy related monies is consistent with the definition of what we, quote unquote, have now defined in South Africa as what it means for us to have a just transition, which is ratified in the Climate Change Act. And I think one of the big things, before I hand over to Mike to continue to speak about this, is that when we're speaking there's a lot of secrecy around, there isn't a lot of transparency around South Africa's just energy transition money. But the one area where there is transparency is around the grants and the grant spending. And so in that, our investigation has focused on the grants. And we found that money that should be given as grants to the South African state to achieve its just energy transition shouldn't necessarily or at all be going to private sector institutions such as global consulting firms to line their pockets as already very wealthy corporations, instead of being channeled intentionally and directly to other local implementing entities to be able to do this.
Mike, could you come and weigh in a bit as well on this issue of where the money is going?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, Luvano, Zen's answer goes to the core of the issues that we've raised. I don't have a huge amount more to add. I think just to maybe be a bit more explicit about it, for those who know a lot about climate finance and are tuning in, we are aware, of course, that the grant funding is already a hugely disappointingly small portion of the just energy transition money that is coming into South Africa. And so for those engaging in the report for the first time, one of the questions might be, why, if so much of this is based on such a small portion, why? And I think just maybe to explain in a bit more detail, just say, first of all, it is because that is where the transparency is. So one of the things that is so disappointing is that the details about the loans are not publicly available. That already is a huge problem for South Africa's just energy transition. But because there is at least some transparency around the grant funding, it allows us to tell a story in that way. And some of those stories we're going to get to in the next section. The other thing, though, which is important to note, is that the people we spoke to, including some experts and insiders in the world of climate finance, indicated that their expectation is that the patterns with the rest of the climate finance, the blended finance and the loans, is going to show very similar patterns to the grant funding in terms of where the money goes, because some of those dynamics that Zen has already described exist for both. And then finally, as Zen has said, I think it's particularly distressing when grant funding, which already is inadequate, is going to very well-resourced and private actors. Now, having said all of that, I think it probably is time to turn to some of the more concrete case studies that people will want to hear about South Africa's just transition. And Luvano, although you are our brave host today, you, of course, this morning thought you were only going to be a panelist. And so I wanted to turn to you with a question about the chapter that you led on in this investigation, which was about one of the consulting firms that really popped up maybe more than anyone else, and that is the Boston Consulting Group, or BCG. So could you tell us a little bit about what you found and the major concerns that jumped out to you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. Let me put my other hat on. Boston Consulting Group, or BCG, is one of those consulting firms that I think avoided quite a bit of scrutiny because they weren't involved in South African state capture, and to the extent that Bain and McKinsey were. And so it feels like that kind of lack of scrutiny or that gap has allowed for them to become a company that is really taking up quite a bit of the public space in South Africa, particularly with regards to, the climate crisis. As far as we can tell, according to the grants register, BCG's made, at least 30 million in JETP funds to work on various projects, to work on coal decommissioning coal plants with Eskom, to work on mobilizing private sector investment for small to medium enterprises in Mpumalanga. These have been highlighted as key areas or key priority areas for the just energy transition. And, also, which I'll speak to a little bit later as well, is that BCG has also received 6 million to work on a contract with the Energy Council to map out an energy transition roadmap, which has huge implications for, the public. And like I said, I'll return to this later, but I think what becomes prominent when you're looking at BCG's role in the climate space in South Africa is that it's very much linked to big business, how big business is shaping the narratives around the just energy transition, because this is where the money's going. And so, similar to the global pattern that BCG is kind of taken on as this lead advisor in climate-related and sustainability issues, it's kind of taking up that space in South Africa as well. And I think it's really notable for everyone to just kind of pay close attention to that BCG has very problematic relationships with big polluters, both globally and here. And so I think this kind of talks to the issues of a lack of transparency and conflicts of interest that have been raised by, Zen, Mike, and Ariella as well. So I think if we turn to the issue of conflicts of interest, while BCG is receiving, jet funds to work on jet-related projects, they also act as a consultant for Sasol, which we know is one of the world's largest polluters and emitters of greenhouse gases. And, they are working, from what our investigation has shown, BCG's assisted Sasol with its green hydrogen modeling, and it's also done so for the National Business Initiative, which again, I'll speak to in a little bit. But, Sasol has spotlighted, BCG has spotlighted Sasol for its efforts to, reach net zero by 2050. But we know that Sasol is not making any such strides. Sasol continues to pollute and, has been given exemptions to actually continue to do so. And I think it's very concerning that BCG has Sasol as a client, and then at the same time received, the 6 million to work on the energy transition roadmap for the Energy Council, which is chaired by Sasol. So I think it's very interesting to kind of question, how did that happen? Was BCG, the preferred candidate for Sasol and therefore the Energy Council as well to receive this money? Or, what other, business interests does BCG have with people who work, with companies that work on the Energy Council? I think another interesting conflict of interest that we found is that Standard Bank is one of BCG's largest clients as well. We know, quite well that Standard Bank is financing the East African crude oil pipeline, which has been subject to huge human rights and environmental concerns. And, it's kind of worrying that a firm that is working on our just energy transition can happily have a company that is making millions off of, or that is, paying millions and will subsequently make millions from this crude oil pipeline, which is, a huge threat to our environment. And so I think these are some of the conflicts of interest that we found during the course of this investigation that, we should be cognizant of. And I think it also goes to the issue of a lack of transparency, which, Mike, Zen, and Ariella have spoken to. And this is very notable in BCG's relationship with its with the National Business Initiative. BCG, the NBI, and BUSA, Business Unity South Africa, have worked on a Just Transition and Climate Pathways project, which is since 2020, which is essentially looking at decarbonization strategies for South Africa's economy. Now, we spoke to a source who was involved in those discussions and said that, from where they stood and from what they saw, BCG basically took over these consultation processes. There was very little expertise in the room and a lack of consistency in the consultants who were showing up, and while NBI said that they were happy with, the work that BCG did, it does give, room for pause, who was actually in the room when these discussions were being had? What does decarbonization, look like when big business is determining what it's going to mean for, everyday South Africans? And I think, another thing which came up in this discussion around the NBI was the relationship between Business Unity South Africa, the NBI, BCG, and Sasol, which apparently was a big voice in the room and kind of steered this project in a way that maybe wasn't so transparent, and, called into question, all sorts of things about the intentions and the motivations behind this decarbonization and what that'll actually look like. And I think, finally, we can come back to some of these points later, but I think it's important that we do talk about what has really come up, and that is the culture, again, around the lack of transparency, but also what consulting firms, the kind of culture that's promoted within that field. And what came up was the fact that, currently at BCG, there are 3 consultants working there who were critical in the capture of SARS during the state capture years because they worked at Bain. And they were critical in the implementing of Tomoyane as at SARS. And I think what is very interesting is that they were found to have been key members of capture, but then they kind of left BCG and Bain and then showed up at BCG and now are sitting at, kind of managing director levels at BCG. And I think that's really concerning because it does speak to one of the recommendations that we make in the report about regulation. Management consultants can operate with almost no oversight, almost no regulation. And so you have, people implicated in, state capture, something that completely, decimated SARS and, really called, into question, democratic processes and all of that, but they are happily living as managing directors at BCG. And so I think before I hand over again to the other panelists and to Mike, if you can come in on some of the management consultants, Bain and McKinsey specifically, I think it is very, very concerning that, BCG has now taken on this position as a leading voice in South Africa's just energy transition and climate space, knowing that that's the kind of culture that's enabled within that firm. So I mean, I'd be happy to talk about this all day, but I know I need to hand over to my fellow panelists. And so, Mike, I've spoken a bit about Bain and McKinsey, and I'd like to, if we can continue that discussion as well before we talk about the accounting firms that were implicated as well in this report. Could you just talk a bit about Bain and McKinsey?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Luvano. Before I touch on Bain and McKinsey, the one thing I wanted to add about the BCG story, especially regarding the Bain consultants that moved there, that's so interesting, is that for this report, and for those who read it, you'll see that BCG did respond to our questions in quite a lot of detail to several of the questions. And we did find it very notable that on the questions on whether they were aware of those individual consultants' role at Bain and why, if they were aware, that they made that decision to hire them in quick succession, that those questions they declined to answer or they chose not to. And I think it was quite noticeable that they didn't want to engage us on those questions. On Bain and McKinsey, and I saw someone in the comments very early on immediately say, oh, very worried, I'm seeing lots of state capture names come up here. And that is certainly something that we're going to return to when we talk about the Big Four. But the findings about Bain and McKinsey, I think in this report are quite interesting for a couple of reasons. And the first is that although McKinsey in particular is absolutely everywhere in the climate space globally, and I've spoken already a little bit about their role at the various COPs and African climate negotiations, very publicly criticized for their role there last year, that we did not see their involvement, certainly in the grant funding and the different institutions that we looked at in South Africa. We didn't see their prevalence in the same way as we saw BCG's. And I think it's important just to flag this and note this, is that our hypothesis and our argument in the report is that is a direct result of their extensive role in state capture in South Africa and the very, very strong public reaction, civil society and public push for them to be held accountable. And a great example of this, again, something we discussed in the report, is that in December of last year, it was announced that the Energy Council, one of the entities that you've spoken about, Luvano, quietly announced that it had appointed Bain on a pro bono basis to help it do some of its project management. Now, the response to that was so strong by the public and by the presidency, essentially telling them not to do it because of Bain's history in state capture, that decision was reversed. And I guess to bring out a positive in our discussion about this is that there are at least signs, I think, that the consultants are facing more scrutiny in South Africa, certainly, than they would in other parts of the world. Having said that, it is so clear that Bain and McKinsey are trying to find ways back into the space. The Energy Council is one example of that. But of course, the fact that McKinsey is playing such a prominent role for the business grouping of the G20 was also something that was flagged in December last year. And of course, McKinsey has a history of consulting in South Africa, not only in the state capture years, but on a range of other issues. And then the final thing I'd say about Bain and McKinsey, Luvano, to really dovetail with what you've spoken about, is that the outcome of the scrutiny on them has really opened the door for BCG to walk into the space and I think not face the same kind of competition as it otherwise might have. And I think the scrutiny of Bain and McKinsey and them being slightly behind the curve in terms of their global experience, in terms of pushing into the South African market in this regard, has really opened up the opportunities for BCG.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I know the focus is on, consulting firms, but we can't talk about them without talking about accounting firms as well. So if you could tell us a little bit more about, what the report spotlights about the role of the Big Four accounting firms in the climate space and, how cautious we should be of these actors as well.
You're absolutely right. And it's something that Open Secrets has written about before, is that when it comes to management consulting, we know the big three are Bain, McKinsey, and BCG. But what that can often lead us to forget is that the consulting revenues of the big four audit firms or accounting firms, as we generally think of them, PwC, Deloitte, EY, and KPMG, their consulting revenues often massively outstrip the revenues of the dedicated consulting firms. They are enormous multi-purpose firms now. And so, as a result of that, I don't think it should come as any surprise to us that they are all over the South African space. And when it comes to the Just Energy Transition grant funding and that database, their names pop up absolutely everywhere. There are two kind of examples and case studies that I want to speak to briefly in the time that we have available, because I think that they illustrate the point that Zen was making earlier about the circular flow of funds. And just before I get to those specific examples, I think it's worth citing the fact that this is inherently a global experience when it comes to climate funding. So a Reuters investigation last year, maybe 18 months ago, tracked $10.6 billion in grant funding from 24 countries and the European Union that was linked to energy transition funds. And it found, as I've said, 10.6 billion of those grants required whoever received them to hire companies, nonprofits, or public agencies from specific countries, usually the donor. And it was the sense that the donor was deciding kind of where the money goes, and essentially they were picking favorites. So now to turn to South Africa's Just Transition grant funding, there are two very clear examples of that start to emerge from the data. And the one is that the United Kingdom certainly tends to favor PwC. So the PwC is the implementing entity on a number of JET projects worth over 130 million rand. And they are implementing entities often alone, but also in consortiums with other consulting firms. Probably the one that's most noticeable and interesting in terms of our argument is that they are often partnered with a firm called Adam Smith International, also a London headquartered consulting firm, and obviously by association with its name, Adam Smith International tends to be wedded to very free market neoliberal ideas about how to proceed and pursue development. So PwC and Adam Smith International working together with grant funding on Mpumalanga-related projects related to water and electricity. And again, because they are the kind of UK favorites. And I think the concern there, again, is kind of twofold. The one is grant funding kind of bypassing South African entities and going straight to kind of donor favorites in this case. But also, as I've mentioned with Adam Smith International, it has a very concerning track record internationally. The projects that it's been involved in, places like Nigeria, Afghanistan, Papua New Guinea, it has tended to favor liberalization and very simplistic liberal reforms, most noticeably a case in Nigeria where its insistence on privatizing energy markets led to a spike in energy costs and increased energy poverty. Now, Adam Smith International responded to us to say they've kind of changed the way that they do their work and that they've hired a lot of South Africans. But I think those concerns about those kinds of entities getting so much of the funding remains. And I would also just say that PwC disappointingly didn't respond to a single question. And then finally, Luvano, very briefly, I just want to mention the fact that while the United States was still providing grant funding, that has now dried up under the current presidency, Deloitte received 145 million rand in grant funding for JET projects. We asked Deloitte Africa, headquartered in Johannesburg, to tell us a little bit about these projects. And remarkably, they responded to us essentially to say they have no idea what we're talking about. They said we are unable to make any direct link between the grant payments you mentioned and us. By implication, they were telling us that none of this flowed through Deloitte's South African office. So these, not only about where they were headquartered, in this instance, it seems like the US funds simply went to a Deloitte entity elsewhere. Lastly, interesting to note, one of those projects was with Eskom. And so Deloitte was paid 11 million rand for an Eskom-related project 1 year after it entered a settlement with Eskom around corruption allegations linked to state capture. There are a lot more examples I wish I could speak to, but I would really encourage people to go to the report and dig in a little bit more detail.
I know. I feel I must say that everyone, please go download the report if you haven't yet and have a look through it, because there's so much to discuss. And so I think, Mike, thank you for that. I think it's really interesting to think about the role that these private actors are playing and the fact that, we're receiving these kinds of responses from Deloitte and others that, it's really interesting. So Zen, I think I'd like to turn to you here, and we can't have this discussion without talking about the Presidential Climate Commission. And I think, the importance of understanding what that body means for, our responses to the climate crisis. And Zen, could you tell us about the PCC and what the role it plays in South Africa's just transition?
Yeah, thanks, Luvano, and thanks to you and Mike for giving us some of the details of the case studies. Just mindful of time as well, I'll start a little bit before handing over to Mike to carry on the Presidential Climate Commission. But yeah, so the PCC is the Presidential Climate Commission in South Africa. And currently the PCC legally exists under NEDLAC. And so until it can be established as a separate public entity under the Climate Change Act, that's where it exists, and it's housed there at the moment. The PCC has an obligation to follow procurement rules under the Public Finance Management Act, so the PFMA, and NEDLAC's own procurement processes. And just for a little bit of an overview, now that the climate change has been enacted, Section 10 of the Climate Change Act allows the PCC to be reestablished as a national entity under Schedule 3 of the PFMA. And the Climate Change Act also makes it clear who is responsible for oversight of the PCC, requiring the PCC to regularly report to Parliament about its work. So I think as far as the PCC goes, which was originally established almost as an interim big step oversight body for South Africa's just energy transition and climate space, has now been given stronger powers under the Climate Change Act, which was brought into effect in October of last year, which is exciting to see, because this is one of the strong recommendations that we make in this report, is to give the PCC more power. And yeah, however, as this provision of the Climate Change Act has not yet been brought into effect, the PCC's housing under NEDLAC still persists until it happens. And the PCC will then have to be reporting to Parliament, which we feel will be a big step into opening the space in South Africa's just energy transition and climate work to allow for public oversight and accountability. Our investigation has one welcome finding with regards to the PCC, and I think Mike will speak more to this just now, but namely that it does not appear to have been too dependent on large management consultants in the way that other public institutions in South Africa have been. However, we do demonstrate in the report, and and as we found, as we've been doing our digging and the writing up, is that it still has relied on private consultants to inform its work, and therefore requires us to be watching them with public scrutiny and vigilance. And we recommend that the PCC be re-established as an independent public entity as a matter of urgency, as envisioned in the Climate Change Act. I think we also think that the PCC must consistently engage with stakeholders and affected communities with care and commitment to improving conditions of those who suffer the brunt of the reliance of coal-powered energy, and also as South Africa is thinking about how and in what direction to be taking its just energy transition. I think public participation, as we've engaged in this investigation with the PCC, former employees and current employees, we found that sometimes the public participation element that the PCC has been involved in has been felt to be sometimes as a tick box exercise, and there is, I think, feedback from those that we've engaged with, as I've mentioned, former and current employees, to take an opportunity to really understand its role and to use the power that it could have to engage affected communities, and to use the power that it has in the commissioners within the PCC, instead of relying heavily on external knowledge. And I think in this way, we find that the PCC has an opportunity here in our country to be the first of its kind, but obviously learning from international examples, but the first of its kind to really be pushing forward Africa's mandate. I think it's clear, as we found, that private corporations will have their own agenda, and that is so much more, and that is why it's so important to have an entity like the Presidential Climate Commission able to be invested in the mandate that was envisioned when it was established, to be ensuring that the public interests are central and push forward in considerations of South Africa's decision-making around its energy and just energy transition.
Thanks very much, Zen. Mike, I'll hand over to you very briefly, if you can just add to what Zen has laid out for us.
Absolutely. I think Zen has covered a lot of ground there, but I would just say on the issue of the Presidential Climate Commission in particular, as Zen kind of hinted at, there's both good news and concerning news in the report. And I think it is important to acknowledge on the good news front a couple of things: that the Presidential Climate Commission was incredibly responsive to us. Unlike a lot of state entities, and certainly unlike the consulting firms, they answered all of our questions. They sent us a detailed list of all the consultants that they've used, which is available in the report. And what's encouraging about that is that for the most part, they are relying more on academic institutions, government bodies with specialist skills, as Zen said, rather than the larger consulting firms. That was certainly welcome. What was more concerning, and this moves away a little bit from the consultants, is that former and current insiders at the PCC, as well as individuals within civil society and other parts of the climate space, raised really serious questions and issues with us and concerns around the governance of the PCC, especially around allegations that commissioners might sometimes be sidelined at the expense of a very overbearing and powerful secretariat. Now, those allegations are strongly disputed by the Presidential Climate Commission and its leadership. But, and I sound like a stuck record here, but for those who are really interested in the governance workings of these types of institutions, I would really encourage you to read the report, which contains, I guess, both sides of these stories and some of those very serious allegations. Of course, one of the overarching issues remains where, for example, the procurement of institutions like the PCC is occurring. But I think that Ariella coming up is going to answer a lot of the questions around, how these institutions are or aren't formalized, and in particular, how any procurement related to the just transition is currently taking place.
Thanks, Mike. I'd like to turn to Ariella here, just to kind of talk us through this issue of procurement, right, in the context of South Africa's just energy transition, and what the report kind of finds are the issues here, and some of the concerns and, lessons, I guess, that we need to be taking from that. So, Ariella, could you talk us through a bit about the procurement processes?
Thanks so much, Luvano. And while we think that procurement and a discussion around how a very big state procures goods and services might be a bit dry, it's actually, to us, at the heart of this issue. So in the Constitution, Section 217 requires that public procurement be in accordance with a system that's fair, equitable, transparent, competitive, and cost-effective. And that's really the gold standard. And the Public Finance Management Act was enacted to give effect to this. So when you hear us talking about the PFMA, that's our Procurement Act. And in terms of the PFMA, all officials at state entities have obligations, and those obligations include implementing an appropriate procurement system and preventing irregular, fruitless, and wasteful expenditure. And as you've heard throughout, these provisions are profoundly important. And as you've also heard throughout, that importance is underscored by the failures that happen in the state capture era. State monies are really never ending, and the provision of goods and services to the state is incredibly lucrative and an opportunity that many people want to take up. But as a result, state procurement must be tightly prescribed so that the public interest is protected. It must ensure fair and equitable provision of services, and it must maintain state integrity and sovereignty. So the way in which the PFMA does this is by requiring and allowing for better monitoring and better accountability in terms of how the state spends the monies that go through it. Where monies are properly spent in compliance with the PFMA, they can be tracked through necessary recording mechanisms. And so this allows for both financial oversight, but also really importantly, democratic oversight, because it subjects the spending of state monies to financial audits, parliamentary oversight, and so we have great accountability if we're following what the PFMA says. So the question from that whole system in relation to consultants that we were asking here, and the way in which we found that consultants have been used by the state in the implementation of the JETP, was expenditure on consultants in the context of the implementation of the JETP, was that subject to the PFMA? If so, what is the extent to which that expenditure is actually being spent in compliance with the PFMA? And then if that is all, if the answers to those are correct, to what extent is that expenditure on consultants being spent in compliance with what our government now defines as the just element of the just transition? And so what we found is that the JETP foresees at least two forms of financial flows this far, and from what we can understand is happening to date. The first is that the loan and the grant monies are transferred from the international partners to the South African state implementing entity. So this is then expenditure by the South African state. But the second, and what we're finding is happening very often in the context of the JETP, is that the international partners envision direct expenditure themselves. So as colleagues have said, that the money will not go through the South African fiscus. It will be spent and it will be routed through those international partners' development finance institutions, and then through implementing entities which are largely in the private sector and as we found, can often be consulting firms. So it creates this parallel system of procurement where the monies don't come through the South African fiscus. They're not formally made subject to the PFMA. And so we don't have accountability and we don't have transparency. We just can't see how that money is being spent, who's being selected to implement what we're saying is South African state policy. And we don't have that level of transparency, and without transparency, we don't have accountability. Mm-hmm. So this is something that we detail in the report that we find to be very problematic. The responses we receive from the state entities is that they're ensuring that even if the money is spent outside of the fiscus, that's in compliance with that really high bar set in the Constitution. But for us, the question is, we have the system detailed in the PFMA. Why are we not using it?
Thanks, Ariella. I think that's especially when we talk about procurement, like you said, it's like that's where we should be paying close attention to, and those kind of systems and checks and balances, because they exist for a reason. And, the lack of transparency is very concerning. And I think, thank you for talking us through that. I'd like us to move it to the question and the Q&A session. And so please keep posting questions, and we'll bring all the speakers back. But just to note also to everyone that the recommendations are laid out in the report, and we'll speak to them a bit as well. But I'd love to open up the floor to some questions. And if I can hand over the first question to Mike. The question is, when you say they are buying up the smaller consultant firms, are these mainly local South African firms or a regional trend? And if so, does this play a role in how they're able to get more grant funding?
Yeah, thanks, Luvano, and thanks for the question. I think that largely this is an international experience so far. That's predominantly the result of the fact that most of the firms we're talking about are headquartered outside of South Africa, and some of their biggest markets remain in those countries. And so certainly the way McKinsey, BCG, and others have kind of hoovered up smaller firms, they've tended to start in the global north. But of course, the second part of that question is that still has implications for the South African experience, because so many of those firms are being hired by donor countries directly in the global north to do this type of work. And so again, relying on individuals with very little understanding of the South African context, very distant from us, and as Ariella said, not necessarily with any kind of shared understanding of our understanding of what a just transition should be. I think also the same individual, I think, asked kind of a related question a little bit later on, which was about, what does this mean for where the money goes and how it impacts local consulting firms? I think certainly for local consulting firms, they will be worried about essentially being bypassed. But our argument is about more than just South African actors, corporate actors being bypassed. It's about the reliance, in many ways, regardless of where they're from, on private sector management consultants, especially when it comes at the expense of any kind of genuine public involvement in what to do about these, existential and generational questions about what we do about our transition.
Thanks, Mike. I think we can move on to the next question, please, if that could also just come up so we can all see it. And this is really around environmental policy and how that is shaped by private management consultants who have invested, who are investing with corporates. So Zen, if I could ask you to jump in a bit about this question, maybe Ariella as well.
Sure, I can go first and then hand over to Ariella. Thanks, Luvano. But I think following on from what you and Luvano and Mike have spoken about in the case studies, and Ariella just giving an overview and what we've traversed during this report is that, this is precisely what we say is the issue here. We're finding that private consultants have not just a seat at the table, but have a driving seat at the table. And I think this is what we are finding as one of the main issues in the report. And I think we have a line there to say that we're not saying, cancel all consultants necessarily, or that all the work of consultants is null and void and should not be relied on. We're not recommending a complete overhaul necessarily, even though maybe that wouldn't be the worst thing, but that's not what we say and put forward in this report. We acknowledge the fact that, yes, consultants do bring an important element to the conversation about thinking through things like the climate crisis and the just transition, but to what extent? And we're finding that the extent to which we're relying on consultants is not only unjustifiable, but actually dangerous. And that's the big thing that we're putting forward here. These are unelected companies that have their own motives to drive. And one of those motives that we all know is no secret, is profit making. And so while, yes, the industry is shrouded in secrecy and there's not really transparency around, not always transparency around what their bidding is, there's no confusion about the fact that their bidding is for profit. And their bidding will never be for the democratic good or the advancement of democracy. And so for us, we're saying not only is that something that we know, as we're uncovering more information, we're trying to figure out what to know and how to hold consultants accountable. We do know what we know, and that is enough to go on. And I think that is what we put forward in this report. Not only that, we draw on the historical modus operandi of consultants to say that the issue about them driving environmental policy is that we have seen a track record of how this they'll never be for the greater good. And I mean, the debate about whether or not that's a good thing or bad thing is not necessarily what we're putting forward here. We're saying that, I mean, it's blatantly clear that that will never be the case. And so for us as a South African state, we are at a juncture here where a just transition for us, with our history and our inheritance with the minerals energy complex, and a future and a possibility to do things differently, it is important that the corporations who will always be for profit are not driving the decisions we're making in that space and environmental policies. And that is, I think, what we're trying to say in a big way in this report.
Thanks, and Ariella, 2 minutes, and then, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Luvano. And building on from what Zen said at the end there, and Mike said earlier that the JETP, our energy transition is, I think he used the words existential and generational. Why are we outsourcing it to profit-driven companies in a manner that does not provide for accountability for how they are implementing this, and transparency, as everyone has said, in how they're being chosen? Why are we outsourcing rather than retaining governance and a sense of accountability over such an important policy that's in theory going to determine so much of our future? So I think it's that which is so problematic. And once again, we have a system within the state that provides for it. Why are we not using it? Why have we essentially adopted policy and created a system that intentionally goes parallel to the PFMA system rather than actually just sitting underneath it?
Thanks, Ariella. I will say we do have to cut the Q&A a little bit at this point. And just to say to everyone, if you could just stay with us for 5 minutes more so we can conclude and continue this conversation. But your comments and questions are really well noted and things that we can continue to discuss going forward. I think there's really provocative, commentary. And I think this conversation is lending itself to a really important discussion, which I think is part of the aim of this report. And so very briefly, we just want to speak a little bit to the recommendations and, kind of round off this conversation with, ways forward. And so I'd like to start off with Mike, if you could just talk us through some of your concluding remarks and maybe 1 or 2 recommendations that stuck out most to you as well from this report.
Sure, thank you, Luvano. And also just a thank you for all of the questions that are coming in, because I think they speak, the questions are going to the heart of some of these issues. I think that maybe as a concluding thought, and it's something that we haven't mentioned explicitly, but I would like to kind of raise it now, is that why are management consultants so popular with big companies and with governments? One of the reasons, obviously they're very persuasive and they're good at getting business, but another reason is that they provide very often convenient, technocratic, and not too complicated solutions. So everyone who knows the joke about large management consultants is like, oh, just cut costs and everything will be fine. And there's a whole range of kind of stories about that. And Ariella has spoken to this a little bit, but just to really say that the definition of the just transition is to change the status quo. This notion about tinkering around the edges of the system and making small technocratic changes is not going to change the direction, certainly of global climate change, but of South Africa's energy issues, the energy crisis, energy poverty, pollution, and those kinds of things. It requires, by definition, a much more radical approach. And I think something we speak to in the report is that is not going to come from the larger corporate management consulting firms. And there's a consultant in the chat saying, not all consultants, and that's absolutely true. There is a space for specialized consulting in this space. But I think if you read the report, you'll really see that narrow focus on the larger consulting firms. And then I think Ariella again might speak to this in a little bit more detail, but as some of the last questions have just come up, is that there is so little regulation in this space. And so if we as the public don't provide that scrutiny, at the moment, it certainly is not coming from anywhere else.
Thanks, Mike. Ariella, can I hand over to you on your kind of takeaways on some of the recommendations that are made, and just what you kind of have uncovered in this report?
Thanks, Luvano. So essentially, if JETP monies are not being spent transparently, we just can't say anything about how they are being spent. Even if it's outside of the South African fiscus, we don't know the nature of the consultancies always, we don't know their intentions, and we don't know who the beneficiaries of these services are when they're supposed to be services geared towards a transformational policy for South Africa's future. So this lack of transparency precludes fairness and accountability when we're spending what is essentially public money. We really can't be outsourcing this most substantial of projects that, as we've said repeatedly, is so essential to South Africa's future. And more to the point, we can't call South Africa's energy transition just when it's neither transparent nor provides for proper accountability. So the issue here, once again, is not that there's no monitoring at all. It's that we don't know who's doing that monitoring and whether it's reliable, because it's not in terms of the already existing system that we've got that should be applying.
Thank you, Ariella. I think, Zen, I think I will end off with you. So I'll just jump in here quickly with my kind of final takeaways and thoughts before I hand over to you. I think that, in this discussion, the issues around accountability and transparency have been critical, monitoring those conflicts of interest. And I think one thing that jumps out, and a comment was made in the chat about the fact that, I will talk about BCG again, because I think it's a perfect example of this. But where there are patterns of misconduct, there must be accountability for that. And we can't invite, firms in with open arms that have facilitated state capture in Angola, firms that have worked hand in hand with, Saudi Arabian government to commit human rights atrocities. And I think we need to be cognizant of the types of firms that we're allowing to do business in South Africa. And so what I will just say is that there are issues around accountability and transparency that are critical to take away from this discussion. And so, Zen, I'll just end off with you to give us your final thoughts, just very briefly.
Yeah, thanks, Luvano. Just to follow on from what you, Mike, and Ariella have said about the recommendations, before I hand over to you for a closing, everyone can have a read at our work and the recommendations, but just to run through them briefly, I think the big one that we say is improved transparency. I think both in the climate and energy space in the country, but also in the consulting space, we feel that this is a place where we should, as the public, have access to information to be able to be engaging meaningfully in processes that are ongoing, but also to challenge and to hold to account all the decisions being made. And this, we say, a practical example of that is making, for one, all the money coming in and the contractual and loan agreements, not just the grant agreements, publicly accessible on the PMU's database for the public to be able to access. And I think that we make 4 other ones. I won't go into them in detail, but securing financing for South Africa's just energy transition. It's exciting that we're getting a global partnership to do this, but I think we know that it's falling far short of where we should be in terms of financially and what we need, and continuing to shore that up and build that is an important step. And I think part of that is recommendation 3, as we're trying to continue to get more money for us to transition from the global north and partners, jet money financing and stewardship stewardship and procurement oversight is one of the things that we name. And we go into detail in the report, which I won't do here, about how some of the ways that we can do this. And I think we've mentioned it as everybody has said in the panel, but also in the discussion and the comments, is regulating consultants. I think this is not the first time as Open Secrets that we've mentioned that this is an important step. But yeah, consultants don't have regulators, and I think they're one of the only industries that don't. And this is one of the big ways we say we can get accountability, and public engagement is the fifth one, and not as a tick box exercise. And I know sometimes it sounds like you're just saying that, but our investigation has found that sometimes these processes aren't meaningful. Communities are left with initial engagements, but not follow-up engagements, and nothing coming from those engagements. And so I think if we wanting to talk about is there meaningful public engagement and how we can address that and to shift that, that's I think one of the most important things. But I think, yeah, Luvano, before as I hand back to you, I think one of the things is that we have an opportunity here as a country to not, we've said this before, not just to have a transition, but to have a meaningful, just transition. And that's why it's important now more than ever for us to engage on this work.
Thank you so much, Zen, and thank you to Mike, Ariella, and to everyone joining at home or wherever you're joining us from. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please do download the report from opensecrets.org.za, and we are really looking forward to engaging with you further on this report and other work. Thank you for joining.